Hi, everyone. Losing a loved one to suicide can be a traumatic and deeply distressing experience that can have a significant impact on your life. You might experience a range of emotions, including shock, anger, guilt, and obviously sadness. You might also feel overwhelmed by the demands of everyday life and struggle to cope with your grief. It's common to have thoughts and questions about your loved one's suicide and to feel confused about the events leading up to their death. You might feel isolated and like you don't have anyone to talk to about your grief. You might also feel overwhelmed by the thought of life without your loved one and unsure about how to move forward. In today's video, we're going to be talking about some of these common reactions and thoughts after the loss of a loved one. But before I get into that, just a couple of disclaimers to go over. I'm a registered psychologist in the province of British Columbia, Canada, and this video is for informational purposes only. It is not intended as a substitute or replacement for advice from your doctor or mental health professional. Now, with those things out of the way, let's start talking about common reactions after suicide. Now, it's important to note that there is no one-size-fits-all to how someone responds or reacts after the suicide death of a loved one. But what I want to talk about is some of the more common reactions and thoughts that people can experience. It's common to experience a range of emotions after the suicide loss of a loved one, and there's no right or wrong way to feel. Some of the common emotions that people experience are feelings of shock after a suicide death, and this can include a sense of disbelief or numbness. You may have a hard time accepting that the death has occurred, and you may feel like you're in a state of suspended reality. With the shock, you may also experience a sense of confusion and difficulty understanding why the suicide occurred. Additionally, shock can manifest as physical symptoms like difficulty breathing, heart palpitations, or dizziness, these types of panic-like reactions. It's a normal response to such a traumatic event, and it's a sign that your mind is trying to process and make sense of what's happened. Feelings of sadness after a suicide death can include a deep sense of loss and mourning. You may feel a profound sadness and emptiness in the wake of the death, and you may have difficulty finding joy or pleasure in things that you previously enjoyed. You may also experience feelings of loneliness and isolation, as well as a sense of hopelessness or despair. You may have difficulty sleeping or nightmares, and have trouble eating or have a loss of appetite. Crying spells and feeling overwhelmed by sadness are also really common. These feelings of sadness may be intense and may come and go in waves, so you may not even recognize or feel that they're coming, but they just sort of come and go, and there's no rhyme or reason. It's important to note that this grief is natural and a normal response to this type of loss. Feelings of guilt after a suicide death can include the belief that you could have done more to prevent the suicide, or that maybe your actions or something you said may have contributed to the person's decision to take their own life. These feelings can be really intense and may lead to self-blame and self-doubt. You might also feel guilty for not recognizing the signs of suicide or for not being there in their time of need. Like you could have been there, if only you had been there more, you could have stopped this. This can be associated with deep feelings of regret about things that you wish you had said or done before your loved one committed suicide. Now, I want to point out that suicide is a complex issue, and it's often the result of multiple factors. And it's not likely that your actions or words alone could have prevented it. It's important to remember that you're not responsible for someone else's decision to take their life, despite how much you feel that to be true. Feelings of confusion after a suicide death can include a sense of not understanding why the person took their own life, and a feeling of not being able to make sense of the events leading up to the suicide. You may question the person's actions and wonder if you missed any signs or signals that something was wrong. It's common to have difficulty understanding the person's thought process and the reasoning behind their suicide. This may also include trouble understanding why the person didn't reach out for help, or why they didn't talk to you about their struggles before they made their decision. And as I mentioned earlier, suicide is a complex issue, and it's often the result of multiple factors, and it's not always possible to understand or make sense of someone's decision to take their own life. It's very common to feel isolated after the suicide death of a loved one. Feelings of isolation after a suicide death can include a sense of feeling alone and disconnected from other people, and a feeling that no one can really understand the depth of your pain and the loss that you're experiencing. And as a result, you may withdraw from friends and family. You may avoid social situations or activities that you used to enjoy because you have no desire to do those things anymore. You may also feel like you're the only one going through this type of loss, and that no one else could possibly understand how you're feeling. These feelings of isolation can be intensified by the taboo and stigma, which unfortunately is associated with suicide. And this may make it much more difficult for you to talk about your feelings or reach out for support. Related to this, feelings of shame following the suicide death of a loved one can include feelings of embarrassment about the person's death, and a belief that the suicide is somehow a reflection on yourself or your family. You may feel ashamed to talk about the suicide or share your feelings with others, and you may feel like you need to hide or downplay the death to avoid judgment or negative reactions from others. You may also feel ashamed of the person who died, as suicide is still stigmatized and misunderstood. And these feelings can be intensified by the taboo and stigma associated with suicide. And it may make it difficult for you to talk about your feelings and to reach out for support. Feelings of anger after a suicide death can include things like frustration, betrayal, and resentment. You may feel angry at the person who died for leaving you behind, or for not reaching out for help, or for not talking to you more about their struggles. You may feel that your loved one betrayed you by not reaching out for help and making their decision. You may also feel resentment towards the person for not considering the impact of their actions on you and the others that they left behind. You may also feel angry at yourself for not have been able to prevent the suicide, or for not recognizing the signs or warning signs that I've talked about. You may feel angry at others who you feel didn't do enough to help the other person, or the person who committed suicide. Or you may feel angry at a system, either a family system or a medical system or societal systems that failed your loved one. Sometimes people can experience feelings of relief after a loved one's suicide, particularly if the person who died was struggling with a mental illness for a long time, or who had been in a lot of pain for an extended period of time. You may feel relieved that the person is no longer suffering, or that your own suffering is over. And these feelings of relief, despite being understandable, can often lead to guilt and shame, as this sense of relief is not commonly acknowledged or discussed. It's not a commonly acknowledged or discussed emotion around suicide. And it can be really difficult to reconcile these feelings of relief with the grief and sadness that also accompany the death of a loved one. So there are a lot of complex feelings that can be associated following the suicide death of a loved one. It's also important to note that there are a lot of challenging thoughts that can often arise following the suicide death. And I think it's important to recognize and be aware of some of these common thoughts. Things like, why did they do this? You might find yourself trying to understand why your loved one chose to end their own life and not being able to come up with an answer. What could I have done differently? You might feel guilty for not being able to prevent your loved one's suicide or for not realizing that they were in such deep distress. What will I do without them? You might feel overwhelmed by the thought of life without your loved one and unsure of how to move forward. Suicide, by definition, is associated with sudden loss that you may not be prepared for, and you're left with a sense of confusion about how you're going to move on without this person. What will people think? You might be concerned about what others will think or say about your loved one's suicide or about your own role in their life. Like I said, there's a lot of stigma associated with suicide, and it's common to experience thoughts that other people may feel bad about yourself or think about your loved one negatively following their suicide death. Could this have been prevented? You might feel frustrated or angry that the suicide could not have been prevented and that your loved one is gone. As I mentioned earlier, this might be associated with thoughts that maybe I could have done something to stop it, or maybe there were systems that failed my loved one that led to their suicide. I can't believe they're gone. You might find it hard to come to terms with the fact that your loved one is no longer alive. This is associated with that sense of shock from the sudden, unexpected loss. I feel so alone. You might feel isolated and like you don't have anyone to talk to about your grief. This is associated with those feelings and thoughts that other people might not understand, or that other people will judge you or your loved one negatively for their suicide death. I don't know how to go on without them. You might feel overwhelmed by the thought of life without your loved one and unsure of how to move forward. Rarely do people expect that they're going to experience a sudden loss of a loved one. And so it's common to have thoughts associated with a lot of uncertainty of moving forward in life without them. I wish I could have done more. You might feel like you could have done more to help your loved one, or that you missed signs that they were in distress. These are associated with the if I only had done X, Y, or Z thoughts that are often unhelpful and, quite frankly, unrealistic with regards to the ability to have prevented the suicide. I feel so guilty. You might feel guilty for not being able to prevent your loved one's suicide or for not realizing that they were in such distress. You may have thoughts about responsibility or thoughts like, if I had only called him that night. So many what ifs that are often unrealistic and, again, unreasonable to have expected from yourself. Now, it's important to remember that these thoughts and feelings are a normal part of the grieving process, and that grief following a suicide death can be more complex and confusing. And I'm going to be posting a video on ways of coping with the suicide death of a loved one, and I'd encourage you to take a look at that video if you're interested in learning more. Additionally, I'd encourage you to check out this video if you want to get a better understanding of why people commit suicide. So that's all for today's video. Thank you for making it all the way to the end of this video, and I'll see you in the next one.